When I was a young boy and I was in primary school, I was a bit of a jumpy guy, still am, but back then they couldn't handle me. And in 5th grade, they even put me behind a pinboard, so I couldn't trouble the rest of the kids in the class. So when I grew older, I became a programmer. I didn't like it very much, so I stumbled into software testing. And I got caught in standards, processes, heavily documented stuff, and I didn't like it. I didn't feel fit there. And one day, I thought back of that classroom. I felt myself behind the pinboard, that I couldn't communicate the stuff I wanted to do. And I stumbled upon stuff by James Buck and Michael Bolton, and they freed me from all these silly processes and standards, and I started to do stuff my own way. They gave me wings to fly. They learned me that software testing can be different. And by creating the right environment around me, doing stuff that I like. I'm a passionate guy. I really, really love software testing. And by practicing a lot, being happy, being persistent, I became what I am now. I recently did a talk at Tesh Bash where I started, I'm awesome. And I think I am.
So next to the awesome Huib Schoots, my name is Alex. We just got introduced, I think, better than we could ever do it ourselves, so we're going to leave it at that for now and get down to the cool stuff that we're going to talk about today. Huib, tell us about our goals.
So our goals for today, we want to talk about storytelling. And we're going to introduce you to storytelling. For those who don't know, there's going to be some theory. We're going to talk about the science behind storytelling. We're going to talk about why they matter. And of course, we're going to tell stories.
We were really pleased yesterday when Michael said this. This was a good lead-in.
Yeah, it's the best introduction we could get.
Yeah. Okay.
So, here we go.
It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed.
Stay hungry, stay foolish. It was their farewell message as they signed off. Stay hungry, stay foolish. And I have always wished that for myself. And now, as you graduate to begin anew, I wish that for you. Stay hungry, stay foolish.
But I want to talk about what I've learned. There's two things that I've learned in the last year. The first is vulnerability is not weakness. And that myth is profoundly dangerous.
The times we were told that we can't, and the people who pressed on with that American creed, yes, we can. At a time when women's voices were silenced and their hopes dismissed, she lived to see them stand up and speak out and reach for the ballot. Yes, we can.
So, these people are telling stories. They are storytellers. We can tell that they're telling stories. They're leaders. They have exciting stories. But just because their stories and their topics are exciting doesn't mean that they're not using exactly the same techniques that we're going to talk to you about today. I swear, Obama, he practices a lot. If he was just reading from PowerPoint bullets, it would be boring too, regardless of what he's talking about. Now, we don't usually have the most exciting, well, it kind of depends on how passionate you are, but we don't usually have this kind of stuff to talk about in our projects. Nevertheless, the techniques are the same, and we're going to talk to you about them today.
Let's imagine you come back from a holiday with these pictures. What will you tell your friends and your parents? Well, let me tell you how testers tell their stories. Recognize this, huh? Remember your last test report? We found 6 critical bugs. We did 600 test cases, blah, blah, blah.
I've never found
Counting.
elephants in a test.
We need stories. And when you come back from holiday, you can tell awesome stories showing these pictures. So why don't you use it more often in your work? So what is storytelling?
Well, so the very easy answer is that it's about telling stories. Oh, my microphone left me. It's not just about telling stories, though. Like I said before, people who tell stories, they practice. If you go to folk festivals and see storytellers, if you watch stand-up comedians, these people practice a lot. They practice, they develop their stories. They write them, they tell them, they share them, they adapt them when other people have put in a different version. Most especially in the oral tradition, stories are changing all the time, and storytellers work on their version, and they get a new version from someone else, it changes and it adapts. And of course, storytelling is also about listening. It's about listening to other people's stories and fitting our stories and our worldview in with how their stories work, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later.
So the basics of a story are, well, it starts somewhere, it builds up, it has a middle, and it ends somewhere. That's easy, right? And there are some elements in there. There are main characters, there's a storyline with development. People like struggle, people like fights. That's why we have fairy tales with black
Ogres.
and white, bad and good, ogres and princesses. Dilemma, conflict, opponents and supporters. Good stories are also authentic and personal, and they make you feel something. Showing these figures doesn't make you feel something. But when you look at them, you will make up your own story.
So it turns out that stories, and loads of people have done loads and loads of work into this, and I think the simplest structural way of looking at a story is Freytag's pyramid. And it turns out that most stories, pretty much all stories, follow this very, very basic structure. We have some kind of way of providing background information, that's our exposition. We have a rising action that's moving towards a climax, what's happening to the hero. You know that in the films, you look at something like, something's going to change here, something's going to go wrong. The climax is when something changes. The protagonist's fate is on the line. Falling action this is where we're resolving the conflict. We're getting to the win or the lose, depending on if it's a happy story or a tragedy. And the resolution, or the denouement, is then the end of the story, what happens at the end. And it turns out that pretty much every story we can tell can and should follow this. First thing to take away, think about this when you're doing your testing reports and other things. And every year there is the Super Bowl commercials, right? And everyone goes crazy about which is going to be the best commercial. And an analyst actually looked at the commercials in advance and predicted, based on whether they followed this structure, whether commercials would be more or less popular. And it turns out in advance, this analyst said, I reckon this one is going to be it because it follows Freytag's pyramid perfectly. We're going to show you it. Try and think where each bit is, and then we'll show you at the end.
Puppies.
Well, you only need the light when it's burning low. Only miss the sun when it starts to snow. Only know you love her when you let her go. Only know you've been high when you're feeling low. Only hate the road when you're missing home. Only know you love her when you let her go. And you let her go.
I have to be we had to watch that like twice before just so I wouldn't cry when I watched it. I really love that video. And it's so simple, it's only a minute long. Exposition, we see one exact shot, puppy adoption, right? Rising action, that puppy is friends with a horse. Puppies are not allowed to be friends with horses. We get that shown to us a few times. The climax, the puppy gets adopted, and this is the heart-wrenching moment. Then falling action, those horses, they go and run, they make a stand and they say no. And the denouement is that the puppy gets to stay and be friends with the horse. So super simple, super powerful, and it was actually the most popular Super Bowl commercial of that year. I have no idea what it's got to do with Budweiser, but suddenly now I need a beer. Take us away from the puppies hype.
So why do we tell stories? And if you dive into storytelling and theory about it, well, one of the most named reasons behind storytelling is it makes understanding easier. Going into the why instead of the how and the what. It helps you convince other people, like puppies make you drink beer, I guess. And a call to action. They inspire and they motivate. That's why we tell stories. They provide grip. They put stuff in your brain, and we're going to talk about that later, that once you do stuff, fully understands what you're doing. They influence people. They connect. By sharing stories with others, we understand each other better, and, well, you feel like you're part of a clan. They help you remember stuff better. Just plain data is hard to remember, but a good story, you'll always remember. Makes data useful. I'm going to show you an example of that later. Don't tell numbers, tell stories.
And one of the most amazing things that stories do, and there are people doing work on this. There's a woman called Amanda Danucci, and she's been doing work in conflict areas, working with, for example, Israeli and Palestinian people, getting them to tell stories to each other of how they live their lives. And before telling the stories, there's a very large sense of, I am the victim, everything is against me. Listening to other people's stories, that's not going to cause world peace in 1 minute. It's not quite that easy. But within that group that she did it with, the people who'd heard other stories were more able to see why that other person would do a certain thing or feel that they themselves were the victim. So empathy is a huge thing that we get through stories. They also teach us. A great book, Make It Stick, tells us that stories are neurological walkthroughs for our brain. It's like a flight simulator. If we go through things like a story, we're learning to do that. They teach us how to do things. And they transmit culture. So much of our culture is through stories and how we do things. How many of you have heard this week the unicorn story? Hands up. If you haven't, ask someone later. That's a great story.
Especially Goiko, he knows all about it.
It's a fantastic story. That's part of the culture of Agile testing days, and so you all know that story. And there's a fantastic English group that sing a song, and they say, without our stories or our songs, how will we know where we come from? That is so important. We have books we read, we have things we do. The stories we tell each other make us come together as a group and as a culture.
So there's a lot of science behind storytelling. And of course, in the early ages, people would share their knowledge, share their stories with each other, and they didn't dive into it. But a lot of people did some research on why stories connect, why stories transmit culture, why stories give meaning. One of it is cohesion. We like stuff that's together, that's bonded, that has cohesion. If I show you this. What's happening there? Can anybody tell me? How? Really? Who's Frank? They're totally not connected.
They have nothing to do with each other.
In your brain they are, because you're telling yourself a story immediately. This is what happened when you throw stuff at people. They will make a story out of what you tell them. They give meaning. If we don't understand stuff that people tell us, we will easily forget it. Our brain will just say, I don't get this, delete.
Or, even worse, we'll make up the meaning, right? How many people have come out of a meeting with two different perspectives on something? I thought we discussed this. Well, what I took away is different to what Huib took away. We make our own if there isn't any there.
They provide us with purpose and motive. Again, the why. The why is so damn important. and also in Agile meetings, I hear people talk a lot about what they're going to do and how they're going to do it, instead of why are we doing this? Why is this important? What's the value? Who are we going to make happy? What problem are we going to solve? Look at this. Sandra let a few squirrels loose. The plan failed when a dog drove them away. Then she organizes a party, but the guests didn't take along their motorcycles. Moreover, she could not turn her stereo loud enough. The installation of a flickering neon sign across the street finally brought success. What's this? Okay, let me tell you. Sandra hates the guts out of her neighbors. And she was trying to get rid of her neighbors. Now, read the story again. Does it make sense? You see, we need purpose and motive.
And one of the things that our brains are scarily good at doing is filling in gaps. We are really good at dealing with stuff that is incomplete. And there is a fantastic experiment by a guy called Gazzaniga, who worked with split brain patients, so people whose left and right hemisphere don't talk to each other anymore. These patients got presented with two images, one on the right eye, one on the left eye, and of course they get crossed over in the brain. Chicken foot on one side, snowy drive on the other. And then the patient is asked to point at a picture that is relevant, is linked to what the patient has seen. And it turns out that because split brain, right hand points at, for example, a shovel, and left hand points at a chicken. And when asked, well, why did you point at the shovel? The brain knows what it saw, but that's not connected to the language. So I was like, well, because it's to clean up the chicken coop. We make stuff up. We don't even know we're doing it. We will fill in the gaps. If there is a gap to be filled, we'll fill it. And that's even with us when we're not split brain. So we need to be aware of that in our communication as well. We need to be explicit, and we need to be aware when there are gaps, because people might fill it with stuff that actually has nothing to do with it.
Managers are extremely good at this. If you give them a half report, they will just make up the rest out of it.
It can be useful. I mean, that could be a... And the human perspective, we're going to be talking a lot about human perspective. There's a fascinating video by Haider and Simmel with two circles and a triangle. And these circles and a triangle are moving in and out of a box. And actually, all that's happening on the screen is that two circles and a triangle are moving in and out of a box. What we see when we see it is a fight, people chasing each other, some kind of love story, some kind of triangle in a house, out of a house. As soon as we see anything, we put a human perspective on it. And that human perspective is something that we need to try to get back into our work when we're telling stories in our work. Huib said before about conflict. It's actually, when kids tell stories, this is an example from the storytelling animal, I think. When kids tell stories, it's always about conflict, and then the world ended, and then the train crashed. We need, as sad as it is, apparently we need that conflict. We need the bad guy. We need the thing that's going wrong. If you read Little Red Riding Hood and there is no wolf, that is not a very good story. I'm not sticking with that to watch that in the cinema for 3 hours or whatever. I don't care who the actors are. And so we need that conflict. But what's even more important is that every story has a hero and an anti-hero, and of course in our own stories, we always think we're the hero, right? I'm the hero of all my stories, but there are some really fantastic ways of looking at, for example, fairy tales, like Snow White from the Queen's perspective, or I think, didn't we find Harry Potter from Voldemort's perspective, right? Sometimes, I'm not suggesting that we're Voldemort, but sometimes it might be worth to see where the conflict is and whether we are maybe contributing to that. And the other thing that we do is we rely on what's known, right? Anything that confirms what we already heard or what we know, we think that is super. Confirmation bias is the best thing. It's a dangerous thing, especially when we're laying out stories and we're remembering things in stories as well. Tell us about the brain, Huib.
Okay, let's look at the brain. The brain is basically 3 parts. Deep down inside, there's the reptilian complex where instinct and survival. As soon as you fall, you will put your arm down. You don't think of that. That's your instinct acting.
I don't do that. I don't have that instinct.
I'm not going to show. We have the limbic system where motivation and emotion come from. And, well, since we're all nerds and work in IT and all beta, we use the neocortex a lot. That's where the reasoning happens. That's where your analytic part of your brain happens. And if you're thinking stuff through, you use your neocortex. But if you go a little bit deeper and touch your motivation and emotion, probably a lot of you have seen the talk by Simon Sinek, Start With Why. What he does is takes stuff a little bit deeper into the limbic brain, touching the why. Because again, it's really important to tell people and to fully understand yourself why you're doing stuff. That's where your motivation comes from. But there's more.
There is more. I get to do brain stuff too. Now, there's been some fascinating experiments done with people watching videos that are designed to evoke distress and empathy. When we're distressed, when we're upset and stressed, that's associated with the hormone cortisol. So that's what we get when we're all up, and then that's the one that goes away when you leave work, and then you get sick when you're on holiday. And if we have empathy, or if we feel love, then that's associated with oxytocin. And it turns out that people who've watched a video that is designed to, it's a really sad video, we can't even show it here, it's worse than the puppies. It's about a kid with a terrible disease. And afterwards, the levels of oxytocin and cortisol in the subjects are increased, and it turns out that how much that is increased will predict how much they will donate to a charity for that specific illness. So it's basically telling stories changes our brain chemistry and changes our behavior based on that. This is why the emotional part of this is so important and why we can't afford to lose that. Not that we're trying to get people usually to donate to charity, but most of the time when we're having conversations, we do want to get people to do something for us or with us or not to stop doing something that's against us. And this is why the emotional connection is so important.
So think about that right before you go in at your yearly review asking for a pay rise. This really helps.
Yeah, show them a sad video.
So, and there's so much more we could tell, but they only gave us 50 minutes. But there's archetypes, basic plots, themes, the hero's journey of Joseph Campbell, narrative techniques, stuff. So we have a tutorial on Friday. If you want to learn more about it, see you there.
Okay, so we've done some talking about theory. Theory is good, but how do we actually use this in our work without showing videos of puppies for every test report? So let's take a look about that. So projects, like I said at the beginning, projects, they're not maybe the most exciting leadership, we're going to show you TED videos of them kind of stories, but they are stories. And there is a why, and there is a reasoning to that narrative. And it is so important to put that together for all of those theory reasons that we've just heard about, because otherwise people will fill it in themselves, they'll forget it, they won't have meaning, and they'll have different meaning for it. So we do need to be telling stories about our projects and about our testing, right?
Yeah. So in rapid software testing, we teach the testing story. We like to talk about our testing. It helps us get overview, keep track of what we're doing, because we like to do stuff without a lot of test cases and without thick plans. So how do you keep yourself on track? Well, by telling others and yourself the testing story. Stories about the status of the product. What is working, what's not working, where are the bugs, things can improve, stuff like that. A story about how you tested it. And why is that important? Well, it gives you the why of the status. And to be fully complete and to enable others to take informed decisions about the information we deliver with testing, you need to tell a story about the value of your testing. So we found these bugs, we did this and this, but we didn't have a production-like system, we didn't have full data, so the performance testing we did, well, it gives us an indication, but it was not really good. Or we lacked information of this part of the system, so we're not sure we fully explored it. So if you give us another day or a product expert, that would be very helpful. So this is basically how test reports often look. And it gives us a lot of information on how many test cases, is it okay, yes or no, findings per part. But I like to use mind maps, and this is just an example. So I can talk about the system, and I can talk with the product owner and with my developers and with my teammates. This is how I perceive the system. This is the structure, function, stuff. Are you okay with this? Where are the risks? So it gives me insight in how the product works. And when I tell my testing story, I might add some icons in it. So the numbers give me the coverage. How well did I test? A 1 is just a smoke test, just did the basic stuff. A 2 is I did all the common and critical testing. And with a 3, we just ripped it apart. Edge cases, complex cases, we did everything. The flags gives an indication of how many problems we found. A green flag doesn't say that it's okay. A green flag says we didn't find any serious problems. And, well, there are some other icons there you can be used to indicate that there are bugs. So instead of showing all these numbers, such a mind map enables me to talk about what I did. So we did the map drive thing. We went crazy on that. We did this, this, and this. It could be better if I had data like this and this, but I think it's pretty well tested, and we didn't find any problems, so that's good. And that's the most important part of the system. And so on, and so on. The testing story really helps me tell stories about what I did instead of showing numbers. Again, numbers are important. Stories about the numbers are more important.
Another place, and we use the word story in Agile quite a lot, right? We talk about user stories. Who are these crazy users and what are their stories? And I want to share a little story with you about this, because we, in the team where I'm a product owner, we were having some really tough times in our user stories meetings. We were sitting in front of a screen, everyone was looking at the Jira backlog, and we were getting into arguments, we were unfocused, we were losing details, and it was, for me as a product owner, it was horrendously frustrating. Anyone been in that situation? Yeah, we can form a group later. What we did after a retrospective was we decided to take away one really important feature of these meetings, and that was the computer. Now, we sit on fat boys or chairs around the table, and when I tell the stories, I tell a user story. I say what problems the user has or what solutions the user thinks they need. Those are not necessarily the same thing. But I talk about why. What is the problem of the user? Why does the user want this? My aim is to generate empathy with the developers, because if they have empathy and understanding of it, then we don't need to discuss all of the crazy stuff. We don't need to document all of the use cases, all of the boundary cases, because they're going to think for themselves based on what they know about the user. And we can form some examples, and we'll refine those examples over the course of the sprint. But if we understand the why and don't talk about the how, talking about how in user stories meetings is the most frustrating thing that I think we can do, because it changes as soon as you write the first line of code, and we still haven't understood what the user wants. So getting to that, was it the reptilian part of my developers' brains? That's going to be a good tweet, isn't it? Getting to the deepest part to understand why is so important. And for us, taking away the computer and not looking at Jira anymore was the best thing that we could do there. And if you look at this, if you look further, stories are actually everywhere in our projects. When we do a demo, do we just click through features and say, and we implemented this, and we implemented this? Or do we take the people watching the demo on the story of how we think the user is going to work with this, and why? Do we start with, well, our users were having this really big problem because they couldn't search for this, and they were having to do everything manually, and they really needed some way of seeing it. So now if they just go here and do this, then they can see that. That's a much better story than just showing a check features. Personas, right? Personas is a story about a person. How is this person interacting with my system? I really love as well Elizabeth Hendrickson's Nightmare Headline game. If anyone's not played that, it's a fun game. And behind that nightmare headline, to discover risk, there is almost always a story. If you ask someone why that would be their nightmare, I'm sure you're going to get a great story about why they think that's the case. Familiar problems is another one, right? Sitting around the bar late at night, oh God, do you remember release 7? When we released it and it was missing half of the jars and it wouldn't even start, and then it shredded the project data? God, we don't want to do that again, right? These are the war stories that we tell each other. These can help us guide our testing and figure out what kind of charters we need. When we're testing, a charter is a story as well. How I'm going through that piece of, how I'm modeling it in my head. I'm telling a story to myself, and I will tell that story later on to somebody else. Everything is about stories. And my favorite one is that when we go and consult with people, what we do then is we take the stories that we've learned from other projects and tell them to others. There's a great example of a hospital where we have checklists and checklists and checklists, but there was one nurse who said, I have seen this before, I know it's not on our checklist, and I think it's this. And those stories are the things that make us able to react even when it's not based on some kind of checklist scenario. So what we're trying to say is that stories are everywhere.
User stories, testing stories. We talked about that. Story mapping has been mentioned before. Product owners, managers in liftoffs talk about mission, vision of the company or the project, explaining complex systems, how stuff works. We use stories everywhere. And I bet you can find more examples if you look around. Stories are everywhere. So you can use stories everywhere to create understanding on an emotional level. Again, the why. And I'd like to remind you that IT is not about technique or computers. There's only the tools that we use. It's creating stuff by humans for humans. And stories will help us understand better, create better products. So, I want you to stand up. No, we're not going to dance. We're not going to sing.
No singing this year,
Just
sorry.
stand up, please.
Everyone stand up.
Thank you, Gita.
Everyone's like, but I just ate. Oh.
Okay, so we're going to give you 60 seconds to tell your neighbor a story about your greatest passion. Go. A shitload of time.
I know, it's good, it's good.
I'm going to give him 2 hours.
Yeah. So you just told one of them to tell a neighbor, so we need to switch it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Looking at the sound in this room, you guys are doing pretty awesome, right? No, keep standing, keep standing. So now switch around. Take your neighbor in the back or find somebody else and now tell them a story about the dumbest thing you've ever done in a project. Go. I just made that up.
That's good. I wish I could take a picture.
So you get their attention back. They're listening to you.
What's the, so we're basically, no, you do one more slide. Yeah.
Really loud. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much. Have a seat.
Have a seat.
So,
What I really loved seeing about that, I wish I had a camera. What I really loved seeing about that is I saw so many people gesticulating and this and oh no and oh and all of this. And I get the feeling, this is the great thing about Agile testing days, right? I get the feeling that if we'd have said, turn to your partner, turn the person next to you and tell them your deepest, darkest secret, that you'd have only write this one time. Thank you.
So, that was easy, right? So now you've experienced that storytelling is really easy. You don't need all these theories, although they can make your stories a lot better. They can make you more confident that you can tell a really good story. That's what I experienced. I took a storytelling course for 3 days, and I was hooked. So I took another 5 days, and in February I'm going to be chief or master storyteller. Because stories are so freaking exciting. And I started to see stories everywhere. If you come to our workshop, Star Wars, Harry Potter, there are beautiful stories in there everywhere. Really cool. So, before Alex is going to tell her story, let me round up here. I think storytelling is natural and easy.
You just proved that.
You guys just experienced it yourself, and I think you did a great job. Looking at all the happy faces and the sad faces and the gestures. Easy. So start telling your stories. Stop creating these boring test reports with all the numbers. Have the numbers ready when they ask for it. But I'll bet that if you start telling your stories to your managers, they will never ever ask for those numbers. The first time they will probably do, because they're used to it. Testing is creating a plan, creating test cases, numbers, 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 and a conclusion. Yes, we want your release advice. Stop doing that. Start telling stories. Enable people with your information, your stories, to make informed decisions. That's what we do as testers. In your projects, but also your stories. If you enter a bar, if you make new friends, you all tell stories, right? So take them to work. Telling each other in teams who you are, what your passion is, why you're here, will make stuff easier. You'll be easier to read, you'll be easier to understand. So be a storyteller.
Okay. So I want to finish up by telling you a story about my violin. I was on stage last year with the violin here at Agile Testing Days Germany, and it's got a really special story for me. It's helped me on my way. It's changed my path in my life, and that's why I want to share this story with you about that violin. So I get my music from my dad. And when I was a kid, he would play his violin, and he would listen to Paganini records for hours on end. And he would make me draw what I could see in my mind's eye from the music. And I think that's where I get my very vivid imagination, most especially when I'm listening to music. So at assembly one day in primary school, our head teacher asked us who wants to learn to play the violin. And I was one of the few kids that stayed behind. We had to sing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star to show whether we had an ear for music. And a week later, I was having my very first violin lesson on a Czech 3¼ size violin. It was a rented violin, which meant that I could take it home to practice on. And the first time I did that, I announced to my rather shocked parents, who I had not told yet, that I was now learning the violin. And the training that I did on the violin was classical at school. So you learn to read the notes, you learn to play the notes, you learn the techniques, you do quite a lot of really rather repetitive and boring exercises. But my dad had different ideas. He taught me to play a folk tune. He taught me to play a folk tune at the time when the only thing that I could do was play the D string and put maybe one finger on it. And this tune went over all of the strings, and it had snares, and it had techniques in it, and everything. He taught me it by ear. No music, no notes. Just listening, repeating, and watching the shape of his hands on the violin. And when my music teacher found out, she was horrified. There is nothing worse for a classical music teacher than people learning by ear. But I was just so proud to be able to play something that my dad had taught me. Now, about a year after I started learning violin, it came the time to switch from primary school to secondary school. And that was going to be a problem for me, because primary school was a little bit of a tough place. I stood out for all of the wrong reasons. I think that a lot of us in this room possibly did. I didn't speak with a strong local accent. I loved learning, and I didn't hide that I loved learning. I didn't wear cool clothes. So kids were pretty mean to me, and I didn't have many people that I could call friends. And the way that the system works in England, at least, is that you have local secondary schools, and they are fed from the primary schools. If I'd have gone to my local secondary school, I would have been surrounded by those people who had bullied me for the next 7 years. So we started looking for alternatives, and we found a school that had a very strong focus on music. It was a school with a lot of competition. It was a very small school. I auditioned on my violin, and I got in. And that was the turning point. That was the fresh start. Because at this school, I learned that it was okay to be different. It was okay to be who I am. I made friends. I made friends that I still have to this day. I played in orchestras, I played in bands, I played in folk concerts. I kept playing violin, and I kept having lessons. And one day, my dad gave me his violin for me to keep. Now that violin, you've seen it on stage, that violin is not a very good violin. In fact, I have been told on multiple occasions by multiple musical professionals that I am the only person in the world that can get a good sound out of it. But it's been on stage solo to lead an orchestra. It has been to Europe to play on those stages, and it got me here, to my very, very first keynote last year. My dad died very suddenly a few years ago. And when I look back, the gift of music that he gave to me is the best thing that he could have ever given me. That was what put me on the path to changing schools, getting out of bullying, moving abroad, learning languages, and here to realize a dream that I didn't even know I had until I heard that I could have it. That battered violin is my most treasured possession. And when I play it, I'm connected to him and to our story. Thanks very much. Did it.
Well done. Do we have time for questions, Mike?
We do.
So, any questions?
Lisa has a question. No,
No.
'cause I stole that before.
The microphone is on her head.
Well, that woke me up.
That escalated quickly.
No, that one doesn't have a microphone. It doesn't?
It sounded like it.
Lisa, what?
Lisa, stop making those silly noises.
It's my aura. Does that work?
Yep.
No. You showed the mind map and using it to tell a story, and I love mind maps, but I wasn't quite clear how you use it. Do you actually sit down with, I don't know, developers or a product owner and go through the mind map and tell
Yeah.
a story? So that's how you use it, as an aid to tell the story.
Yeah,
not by
I never use mind maps to send it to people because they
Okay.
don't communicate well.
That's what I
But they are my script
Okay. That
for
makes
telling
sense.
awesome stories.
Awesome.
I think Bart has a question.
You gotta move with care. You don't know where the boundary is.
We can play a really funny game with Mike. Like the next person, ask over here, and then...
That's a cool game. I forgot my question. Maybe you can come back later. We were just talking to each other about one of our passions, and of course it's easy to tell a story about your passion. But if I have to go to the 25th test management meeting and tell them the story about my testing, I'm not sure whether I can be
Really?
that passionate.
Really?
How's that going to work? Yeah.
So, you don't love your work? You're not passionate about the results? Blood, sweat, and tears after weeks? And you're going to say, this is
Yeah, but if I have
Come on, Bart, I know you better.
If I have to go in the 25th time and have to tell them that basically because of environmental issues we didn't make any progress for the last week as we did the 3 weeks before, I'm not sure whether I'm going to be that passionate.
I think that's a good story to tell, right? I mean, if you tell the story of how this is really getting frustrating and you and your team are, we had this in a project that we had night shifts to do testing, and you get there and you've done blood, sweat, and tears, and please, people, please do this, and thank you so much for doing this, and then they get there and the environment's down. That's a good story to tell. That's also the time when you need to be using the emotions, because otherwise they'll just be like, yeah, Bart's annoyed again, but he'll live. Meeting 26, that's fine.
And to add to that, if you would write a report, I sometimes still do, and you can also use the testing story in your reports, but the reports are dull. My story is for multiple audiences, so I have to write multiple reports if I'm doing it right. So I'd rather tell my story, and then they can see the passion in my eyes if I'm happy, and they can see the frustration in my eyes when I'm not. I think that emotion that adds to your story instead of putting it on paper. Again, sometimes you need to write stuff on paper and it helps you construct stories and summarize and blah, blah, blah. All fine. But having a mind map like that, going around telling people about what the stuff I do, I think it's way more valuable.
You need to be clearer, Keith.
It's on? No, it's on. Yeah.
Hey, Lars.
Hi. I'm just wondering, like, what about when this is a multi-layered organization and your direct supervisor says, yeah, I understand it much better now, but still, I'm required to hand out numbers, and they're not comfortable telling stories in themselves, and they feel pressure that, no, we have to give them numbers. So thanks for the story, it helps me, but I still want those numbers.
Yeah, so I'll give them the numbers, but they get me too. Because again, I'm not saying I will refuse to give them the numbers, because then I will write my story to go with it. But I'd rather tell my story. And let me give you an example. There was this financial institute thingy bank, and the financial director asked that same question. So I'm not interested in all the bluff, blah, blah, blah. Just give me the numbers. I said, what kind of numbers do you want? He said, the number of bugs you found. I said, okay, that's cool. I can give you that. What are you going to do with it? I said, are you going to draw conclusions? Yes. Well, I'm better qualified to do that. Why don't I help you? Let's go through it together. And he said, oh, might be a good idea, but I'm busy, blah, blah, blah. So show up whenever you want, I'll talk you through it. And afterwards, he thanked me for doing that, because he said, well, normally the reports give me a false feeling of confidence, and talking to you, giving me insight on how you did stuff and why it's good or not good, gave me more stuff, more grip, more insight in what you actually did.
I think as well as an element of leading by example. So even if you go to have your meeting, tell a story about it, and if the stories stick, right? We've talked, we remember stories. And if that person, even if when they go to their meeting, to their manager and say, well, here's the numbers, when they drink coffee, I'm betting they're going to tell that story. And that's going to help. So start doing it, and it might spread. But not doing it is the best way to get it not to spread.
And it gets you into board meetings.
Yay.
Okay, on that note, we've run out of time for questions.
We're going to hang around, so we'll...
You can hang around? Yeah. All right. Storytelling. Amazing, amazing, amazing. A round of applause, please, for your keynote speakers.
Thank you very much.
Huib and Alex.